Hello, everybody, and welcome to the OWI Institute webinar, Trust Frameworks. My name is Katie Stevens, and I'm the Director of Education at OWI. Here at OWI, our webinar series is developed to bring you the latest research analysis about identity, trust, and safety, presented by OWI's research team, as well as leading industry experts. Upcoming topics in the series include using biometrics for trust and safety, as well as incident response and trust and safety. Before we get started, I want to take care of a few housekeeping items. First of all, throughout the webinar, poll questions related to the content will appear on your screen. These are intended to give us a sense of who our audience is, as well as to track continuing education participation. So when those appear, please take a few seconds to answer them, and then we'll share the results with the group as well. If you logged into the webinar today with the email you registered with and you participate in those polls, you'll receive a certificate of participation by email this week that you can submit to your professional associations for continuing education credit. If at any point during the presentation you have a technical issue, please use the on-screen chat button to chat with panelists, and we will do our best to help you. And lastly, should you have a content question during the presentation, please use the Q&A button at the top or perhaps the bottom of your screen to send questions to our team. Our presenters today will attempt to answer as many as they are able during the Q&A period at the end of the presentation. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Don Thibault, President and Chairman of the Open Identity Exchange, and Annette Steenbergen, co-founder and initiator of the Aruba Happy Flow project for the government of Aruba. We will be engaging in a discussion of both of their work around identity trust frameworks. The Open Identity Exchange, or OIX, is a nonprofit, technology-agnostic organization of global leaders from the private and public sectors, and a testbed for business, legal, and governance best practices and policies, which operate the OIXnet registry. Don is the chairman of OIX UK Europe and the co-chair of the OASIS Electronic Identity Credential Trust Elevations Method Technical Committee. He is also the executive director of the Open ID Foundation, a standards development organization. The foundation's membership includes leaders from across industry sectors and governments that collaborate on the development, adoption, and deployment of open identity standards. If you'd like to hear more from Don, be sure to check out his blog at donthibault.com. Annette is joining us from halfway around the world. She's on a completely different time zone than most of us here, so we appreciate her taking the time and extra coffee required to stay up late into the night. She is the co-founder and initiator of Aruba Happy Flow project for the government of Aruba. The Happy Flow project is the first single token initiative that creates a seamless flow of passenger facilitation from curb to gate through the reuse of biometrics and advanced cooperation between public and private sector. Taking the stakeholder cooperation to a new level turned out to be in everyone's interest and raising the passenger experience, creating room for growth, and making the process more safe and secure. In 2016, Annette took on the chair of the International Air Transport Association's Passenger Facilitation Working Group and has a seat on the IATA's Passenger Experience Management Group. Since 2017, IATA started the One ID Task Force, residing under the PFWG, that is looking at creating interoperability between airports with a seamless passenger flow. This trust framework is looking at the required standards and best practices to prepare the aviation industry for seamless travel. I am very excited to have these two here today, as their joint expertise provides us a unique opportunity to explore the general structure and function of trust frameworks, as well as to examine the specific use case of trust frameworks within the airline industry. Let's go ahead and get started with our first audience poll. Please take a moment to look at your screen and let us know something about your expertise around trust frameworks. Okay, here are the results from that poll. We've got a fairly mixed audience, with most folks falling into the average understanding category, which is great. I think that the specific context that we'll be looking at today will help clear up a lot of the issues that folks might have around that. So with that, we will get started. And Don, I'd actually like to start in particular with a question for you. Given the work that you've done with OIX, can you give the audience a general working definition of a trust framework, including specifically the goals of those frameworks and an idea of the types of problems that they are trying to solve?
Is to set out the technical, business, and legal requirements for the participants in the trust framework. So again, at the end of the day, a trust framework is words on paper. It is a contract. And what it seeks to do is to make sure that all the parties to that contract, to that framework, are performing the duties and engaging the liabilities as set forth in that agreement. I think one of the reasons that it's great to have the IATA trust framework and One Identity program represented here by Annette is that it gives the folks listening a real world example of a trust framework and the complexity of getting there. The great thing about IATA, the International Air Transport Association, is that it started with the passenger, or all of us, in mind. And it conceives of the One Identity program is part of a literal user journey where we can move through the airport without ever breaking stride. So given the expertise of the folks that are listening to me, we all know that as you move through that airport, from curb to airplane, a whole series of security, privacy, legal, and logistical operations are happening all around us. So by deconstructing that journey and looking at it in terms of a trust framework, we can understand why a trust framework is necessary and what the job is that it does. But first and foremost, we all have trust frameworks in our pockets or pocketbooks. And probably the most well understood example of a trust framework is that employed by Visa or MasterCard, where you have a whole wide variety of financial services institutions, banks, merchants, technology platform providers, and the consumer, the customer, all cooperating in a system that's been revolutionary on a global basis. And that is the framework, the trust framework that binds all those actors, produces the seamless or low friction experience that we have when we use credit cards today. The credit card trust framework gives us an example of why these frameworks are useful. First and foremost, because they scale quickly. So the 4 values of a trust framework, the scalability aspects, the ability to go global or to be built or designed with the internet scale in mind, is really a key piece of why we use trust frameworks. The other value propositions, if you will, of a trust framework are that it promotes global interoperability. It also promotes openness or transparency, or you could say trust. And lastly, it provides real savings and opportunity cost and time to market for its participants. So again, the quick summary up front is that a trust framework sets out the business, legal, and technical requirements of those participating in the framework. And the reason that we use trust frameworks are because it fosters and promotes interoperability. It scales on a global basis. It promotes trust and transparency. And lastly, it provides real value in terms of time to market and opportunity cost. And we'll talk more about each of those elements in in particular.
Thank you, Don. Can you speak a little bit more specifically to why a trust framework versus something like an ISO standard or a regulation or policy that might establish the kind of relationships you're talking about?
Yeah, trust frameworks often and importantly invoke standards. And certainly ISO standards are part of a panoply of standards that a trust framework may specifically call out. So the benefit of an ISO standard or a standard like OpenID Connect or industry-specific standards is that they bring with them some consensus and some legacy of development that provide those standards. So a trust framework often references and links to standards that describe the kind of operational responsibility that each participant has. The other piece of your question is interesting too, which is, what are my alternatives to a trust framework?
Right.
So today there's basically three, and again, we're talking about identity systems at scale. And what I mean by that is, in terms of scale, is they're identity systems that cross boundaries, that are not only big geographically, but also, and importantly, have a high volume of transactions that the trust framework is guiding. So when you're looking at identity systems at scale that have high volume requirements for trusted transaction, high velocity requirements, we're going to do a lot of things really fast, and a variety of transactions, that's why trust frameworks can be beneficial. The alternative is, and I'm sure many folks have gone through the pain of trying to negotiate a bilateral contract or a partnership agreement. And often that can be painstaking in terms of getting all the experts in the room, all the lawyers in the room, and negotiating you versus the organization on the other side. So we have bilateral contracts as one option. The other option is that we have what we can call loosely coupled SLAs, service level agreements, where companies or organizations say to another organization, you keep doing that and I'll keep doing this. And that works well as long as you trust each other, as long as organization A keeps doing business in a certain way from a business, legal, and technical point of view, and company B can collaborate or work on a corollary basis. So we have bilateral contracts, we have loosely coupled SLAs, and then multilateral or multi-party contracts, trust frameworks. So the challenge, and I mean it is a challenge, of organizing and negotiating a trust framework is not for the faint of heart. Difficult to get a team of rivals to agree on operating in the same way at the same time, to operating within a set of standards that might be referenced in a framework, and to do so with the same understanding of each of their duties and responsibilities, and most importantly, for each of them to assume some liability for the specific actions that they take as an actor in a framework.
Thank you. We actually have a question from our audience that is relevant to the points that you're making right now, Don. So I'm going to read that, and it's specifically addressed to you, but I also think that the question of kind of pulling people together from various backgrounds might be relevant to the work that Annette's done. So Annette, please feel free to jump in if you'd like. The question comes from Michael McGrath, and he says that for global interoperability, every trust framework would need to trust each other and have a written agreement in place. No? How do you, Don, feel about using the IDESG's identity ecosystem framework serving as the baseline for trust frameworks to abide by for interoperability between trust frameworks?
The IDESG has done a great job in developing this whole notion of a trust framework and the notion of a registry. And I'm an admirer of their work. I think what what IDSG can do importantly is to project a US view of how these frameworks address the important issues of security, privacy, and ease of use. But IDESG is one of a set of global players that have to interact and interoperate. So the IDSG in the US, there are different groups, of course, in Europe and in Asia. We're looking at exciting new developments with the public and private sector in Australia. All these actors and organizations are trying to do the same thing, which is in an increasingly less trustworthy internet environment, how do we build trusted transactions into identity systems and at the same time produce a more secure environment, a more privacy protecting one, and one that's still easy to use.
So, Don, I was going to talk a little bit more about specific examples of trust frameworks, but I think you covered that very nicely with your comments on payment cards, and I know we will dive very deeply into that in a few minutes with Annette. So, you've used the term a few times, identity system, and trust frameworks specific to those. So, I'm wondering if you could provide some clarity on what you mean by identity systems and how trust frameworks relate to those specifically versus a trust framework that might work in some other kind of system.
Yeah, there are, I mentioned different kinds of systems, but as an identity professional, I see identity in them all.
Right.
But by identity systems, I simply am using that as shorthand for a set of stakeholders, a set of actors in relationship to each other. So an identity system typically will have identity providers, relying parties, attribute providers, and often invoke or reference not only international standards, but governmental best practices or regulations or rulemaking. So when I say identity systems, I'm simply talking about a shorthand for the kind of work that many of us are doing. The reason that trust frameworks have particular value in identity systems is because identity systems by nature are interoperable and often international. So the complexity of crossing physical borders, as well as regulatory regimes in identity systems is becoming more and more challenging, which is not news to anybody on the line here, but is the kind of everyday work that if you're an airport manager, or if you're an airline, or if you're a regulator of air traffic and transportation, identity systems are smacking you in the face every other day.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue to where we want to head. We've got our bearings now on what trust frameworks are and how they interact with identity systems. So I'd love to take a deep dive into the specifics and examine the particularly interesting use cases that Annette's work deal with. So before we start that, let's do one more poll question with the audience just to get a sense of their familiarity with the kinds of technologies that the Happy Flow project utilizes. I'm going to open that poll up to our users. All right, and now I'm sharing those results, and we can all see that, as before, we have a fairly mixed audience in terms of their expertise around biometrics. So that'll be good for us to keep in mind as we go on with the discussion. To frame this, I want to recall, Dawn, the OIX white paper titled Trust Frameworks for Identity Systems. in which your organization outlines 6 characteristics that a trust framework has: scope, purpose, form, content, authorship, and enforceability. So let's take a look at each of those in the context of Annette's work. So if, Don, you could kind of describe for us each of those characteristics, and then Annette, if you could relay for us what that looks like specifically, or what challenges you've seen around that characteristic in your work, I think that would be a really great way to bring all of these points home to our audience. So let's see if we can get started with scope.
Yeah, I think often trust frameworks importantly interoperate with other operations and other frameworks. And Annette's will describe the really challenging environment that she works in with a framework developed for travel in Aruba that has to interoperate with global airlines, other airports, global regulators, etc. I was just at the Customs and Border Protection Agency this morning, and they're really interested in identity systems because the US will require not only positive identification on the way in via traditional passport checks, but also identity checks on the way out of the country. So identity systems and airline travel are being stressed to the fairly well these days. So scope is a really key issue. Even small countries and small airports like Aruba are important pilots and part of an airline system that requires both the airlines that use the airport in Aruba as well as Aruba governmental authorities to be mindful of interoperating with airports around the world. And Annette is particularly well positioned for that because she's a diplomat by training and an identity expert by virtue of trying to sort out some of these issues we've talked about. So Annette, I'll let you talk a bit about your use case.
Okay, well, good afternoon, good evening. Our use case in Aruba started about four to 5 years ago. It didn't happen overnight. We had the opportunity to come together with the airport of Aruba, the government of Aruba, KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, and as a supporting partners, Schiphol Group and Dutch government following everything closely. And we decided to see if we could drastically innovate passenger facilitation at the airport, but start small. So we started and currently still are working together as operational partners, the government of Aruba, which is immigration, of course, the airline and the airport. And we have come together in what we call the Happy Flow, which is a seamless airport passenger facilitation through the reuse of biometrics. Maybe it's good if I go over just quickly what it means, what we have right now. Don, would that be a good idea?
Sure.
Yeah. So just for you to imagine, I mean, everybody travels, so everybody knows the process of traveling on an airport. In this case, it'll be international travel because it'll be flying to Amsterdam on KLM. You arrive at the airport and you go to the check-in kiosk. And at the check-in kiosk, you present your passport. It's read, it's verified, authenticated, and it's an e-passport. So the chip is read, and while you look into the camera at the kiosk, your biometrics is verified against the biometrics in the passport. If all that is correct, we take a picture and we store it in a personal data envelope. And after that, your regular check-in proceeds. From that moment on, you are, if your passport is correct, of course, you are in the Happy Flow. and you have a reservation for your flight. You do not need a boarding card anymore because your face from that moment on is your boarding card. So we have one identification, and we will reuse your identity simply by biometrics. That means stepping up to to backdrop. You walk up, the camera catches your face, you are identified, and your back tag is printed and attached to your bag. Then you proceed to immigration in Aruba, which follows after, and it's not only immigration, it's also your airside access. Because of course you can only go airside at an airport if you have a reservation for a flight. And as you're enrolled in the Happy Flow system, you have a reservation. So we have that border control point exit check together with your airside access check in one. You walk up to the automated border control gate, and you do not need to present your passport. You just look in the camera, it recognizes your face, and it opens the gate, or not, of course. Let's say, of course, everything is correct. It opens the gate, and you proceed to go airside. There is security. We do not have that included yet. And then you're in the international lounge. You can shop and eat. And later when you board, again, you only present your face. So basically, we've changed your face for your boarding card. We still print a boarding card simply because people like to be reassured of the times that they have to present themselves, seat numbers, flight numbers, etc. But your face has become your boarding card. This is done by connecting the public and private systems at the airport. So we have created a platform that connects the government, the airport, and the airline. And there is a personal data envelope that was created that virtually travels with you throughout your steps at the airport up until boarding. The scope right now, as you heard, is one airline, the airport, and government. And the reason we started with this small scope is the fact that it hadn't been done before. We're actually the first in the world to have developed this. And we needed to build it up. So it took us 2 years in a project. We took innovative steps per 3 months. Evaluating after every 3 months, and we have finished those 2 years, and are currently looking at expanding the scope. That'll be project-wise again if we talk about going cross-border, and at the airport they're looking at expanding by having more airlines join. So first of all, it's never been done before. We couldn't benchmark. We didn't have an example. So we had to learn on the go. A lot of that learning had to do with coming together as stakeholders. Now, at an airport, airports, airlines, and governments are incremental to an airport. Otherwise, an airport cannot operate. But what is most important to an airport is the passenger, because if there's no passenger, nobody needs to show up. It may seem simple, but it's sometimes good to go back to basics and to realize what you're doing. So for us, it was very important that we have developed a completely passenger-centric system. And that required these stakeholders at an airport that have worked together for forever, since airports exist, to take it to a next level and to have a shared responsibility for this identity management system. So the scope for now is simple. but we keep it like that for now. The airport is expanding, renovating, more airlines will join. We are preparing to look at, as I said, going cross-border. We're also preparing to look at, could we connect hotels? Could we connect retail? Could we even make it round trip? So there are a lot of plans for scope, but for now, again, as I said, we're the only ones who have done it so far. This is what we have.
Okay, I think that your clarification there of what the scope is right now versus what you think it might be at some point in time ties in very nicely with a listener question we had, which goes back to the definition of scope. John, so perhaps you can handle this. I think she's asking for some clarification. By scope, do you mean that any good trust framework would have to define its scope? So is that a fundamental characteristic for a trust framework?
Indeed. What a trust framework does, it says who are the actors in the identity system? What actions are they performing? What duties do they have? And what liabilities do they incur? So the importance of scope goes to the fundamental product of a trust framework, which is twofold. It lays out very clearly who's responsible for what. And it also anticipates that when things go wrong, as all things do eventually, who's liable for what. So having liability pre-negotiated and sorted out among each of the actors, depending upon the action that they're taking, what duties do they have, and sharing that openly produces a trustworthy system. And by trust, I mean something very specific, which is the reliability and repeatability of the system.
Okay.
So in the case of Annette's Happy Flow in Aruba, while it's a small island, it has to interoperate with a huge influx of American tourists to power the economy, as well as being a player in a global transportation system and all the liability and regulatory burden that they take on.
Maybe I can clarify a bit more what we have done in that respect. When we were developing our Happy Flow, we didn't know exactly where we would end. We knew we wanted this innovative project. Like I said, there was no example of what we were doing, so we designed what we did, and we moved ahead. We did understand that we were in a bigger scheme of things working. It's not just us. There are rules and regulations. There are laws that we had to adhere to. KLM, being a Dutch airline, needs to adhere to European rules and regulations. In this respect, especially the privacy laws are very important. So we learned a lot along the way, and we realized we would probably have to put something on paper. And we realized we had to do something with privacy. It was basically that simple in the beginning. Luckily, we had very good advice on how to proceed. And we had a privacy impact assessment done between the stakeholders. And I clearly remember reading that document, because once I read that document, when it was written, when it was done, it made clear, and this is what Don also talked about already, who has what responsibility, how is our liability arranged, and what can we do with all this data that we're sharing? Is it allowed, and what do we need to do? So that was very important for us. We have, that resulted after the privacy impact assessment was done between the stakeholders, we created a privacy covenant. And that was what Don referred to as the piece of paper with signatures. And that was extremely important to get everybody, I always like to say, relax in their seat. What are we doing? Can we do this? Can we connect all these systems? Can we share this information? And can we do this in the international setting that we are in, with all the the data that we're dealing with. So that was extremely important for us.
Great. Okay, let's move on to our second characteristic. I think to some extent you may have touched on part of this, Annette, with your description of the specifics of the flow. But Dawn, can you give us a sense of what you mean by the purpose of a trust framework? And then Annette, can you relate that back to the work that you've done?
Yeah, I think this goes to an important distinction in a good segue from scope. There are many stakeholders in identity systems. Privacy advocates are a good example of a stakeholder. But all stakeholders are not parties to a trust framework. They may influence it through standards, through other regulatory and rulemaking requirements. But the fundamental job of a trust framework, again, is to assign responsibilities and allocate liability. What that does is it gets everyone operating on the same set of rules. Once you can do that, what happens with the trust framework is that it becomes scalable. And by that I mean more parties to the trust framework can be added more easily. And what I mean by that is that the terms and conditions of the trust framework are already clear. They're already agreed to. So it makes it easier for a new vendor or a new participant to understand what their liabilities, their duties, and the opportunity is well in advance. So trust frameworks can scale easily. They're tough to put together, as Annette can attest to, but they do offer this important scalability and interoperability function that we've talked about. So the purpose of a trust frameworks from a tactical perspective is to assign responsibilities and liabilities. From a strategic perspective, it is to be trusted. And by that I mean, by having these requirements, business, legal, and technical, well known and transparent to current and future participants, we can have a level of trust that leads to the kinds of transactions that we've talked about. So the purpose of a framework is to provide that fundamental trust on a strategic level and the operating rules and of the road for the direct participants.
Got it. Okay, so Annette, can you talk specifically then about, as you designed the system in Aruba, what your intended purpose was and how that related to the parties involved and the framework you developed?
It wasn't until I first had I'll call it a lecture from Don about trust frameworks, that I realized that what we had created was a trust framework. So I didn't use that terminology, and we used it, we said it's our cooperation. Now I realize it's a trust framework. And it totally made sense when I understood what it was, and I immediately realized the importance of naming it a trust framework because of the fact that the word trust is in there. And having worked on building up this project with all these stakeholders, with all their interests and their different politics and policies and interest, the creation of is extremely important. It's all about getting around the table and agreeing and being okay to listen to the other and being equal in your partnership. So that word trust shouldn't be taken lightly, because you can put things on paper, but before it's on paper, that's where all the work is done, of course. And we know all this, but if anybody listening is looking at starting a trust framework, having gone through one in Aruba and now in IATA looking at setting one up globally, it takes a long time, and but it's extremely important, because you will not get your trust and you will not therefore reach your purpose. to have it done and to have on paper what are your standards, who is responsible for what, the transparency around it is, I think, a very important part. Why is that stakeholder demanding that and that stakeholder demanding that? Which also has an extra benefit if you work on this purpose, because it will help you understand your partners, your stakeholders better, which will help create the trust framework, because then you see there is a win-win situation for all involved. This is what I mean by creating the next level stakeholder cooperation at an airport. These silos have been there for a century, ever since the Wright brothers started flying, I think, and we created the first airport. You have had the silos of an airport, an airline, and government. But this really makes them work together in a new sense, whereby they have a shared responsibility. And only if you understand who has what liability and why, and who has what responsibility and why, will you be able to get it done.
Great. So Don, the next characteristic you'll talk about is form. And I'm very curious about this. Some clarification around what different forms for a trust framework might be would be helpful to me personally, and hopefully that translates to our audience.
Right. Form follows function. And what we mean by form is that we want to locate the framework in a specific set of laws. We have three different kind of legal touch points or contexts for the framework. The first is kind of general commercial law. The trust framework has to be consistent with the laws and regulations of a particular jurisdiction. And then we go to any general identity management law that a particular jurisdiction may have. Again, it's easier said than done, because in Annette's case in Aruba, they have to be mindful of GDPR in Europe and the changing security requirements from the current administration in the US. So the commercial, general commercial law, any general identity management law, and then any specific form that the framework will take itself. It may create a best practice, or as we said earlier, may invoke an ISO standard. So it's really the sum of those three parts: general commercial law, general identity management law, and identity system specific rules and standards that really provide the form for the trust framework.
Okay, so Annette, how does that relate specifically to what you've done in Aruba and what you'll be doing with IATA?
Well, that's going back to the very first question that was asked. That was actually a very good question, I thought. You look at the different levels of trust frameworks connecting. Aruba is a local trust framework. And as we have only one airport, it's also our national trust framework for passenger facilitation. So we have our own governance at the airport for this trust framework. We've written that down in our privacy covenant, which is our piece of paper with signatures, to quote Don again. So that was pretty clear, because it's the people who are there, the stakeholders involved. You get around the table and you agree. But looking at the One ID project for IATA, we're looking at lifting or connecting local trust frameworks, probably to a national version of the trust framework, if you talk about bigger countries which have more international airports, and then creating an international trust framework, so lifting it to the final level. And we are, maybe it's good to clarify, we are in the process of understanding how we can set this up, how we can get everybody to agree about standards, what those standards should be, what the process will look like, what the governance will look like. We've been busy for a year now. We've had 5 meetings. And for you, just to paint the picture, when we have those meetings, it's an IATA task force, but invited are not only airlines, but also airports and, of course, governments and vendors. So we have quite some discussion. It's a very conceptual topic, so it's difficult because we're still evolving this. We have the concept paper out now, and the form it will take, we don't know yet. It looks like, because we have to deal with different models. We have to deal with a seamless flow in the US with the US model, connecting hopefully, in the future, with a seamless flow in Europe, with the European model, with different legal systems that both sides need to comply to. So we need to find a middle ground with some standards that will allow us to become interoperable. And for that, we will need to, and this is where we're still looking at how we will do this, create some kind of governance, I think, where representatives of these national trust frameworks, or it may start out with local trust frameworks, so big airports. We have a lot of big airports around the world that are looking into creating a seamless flow. Schiphol, Heathrow, Hong Kong just mentioned, gave an interview that says they're doing this. Australia is very active, Dubai, Hamad International Airport. Those are all airports that are looking into doing this. And they're also looking at what form are we going to have to come up with to organize ourselves. So this is one of the reasons we work closely with OIX and take a lot of advice and direction when we have those meetings, because this is quite difficult. I think, I'll give you my idea, and I don't know if that is where we'll end up next year or the year after, but I think we will have a set of standards around technology, which will probably be open standards to make sure there are no vendor lock-ins. We will have some legal standards, and we will end up with a governance. That is what I see happening. But the form of the governance, the laws we have to adhere to, privacy by design, I most certainly think that will be a technical and legal requirement. And I can imagine for many airports that want to deal with European airlines, GDPR will have to be something to comply to. So we're in the process of finding it all out.
It sounds incredibly challenging. In the interest of time, and also because you've said a few things that have brought this to the front of my mind, I want to jump ahead a bit to the last characteristic, which is enforceability. Don, you mentioned earlier that one of the fundamental pieces of a trust framework is to outline the liability and how all of that is dealt with as information is handed off. And Annette, you've talked specifically about incorporating all of these standards and policies from around the world into this framework. Once all is said and done, how does that get enforced? How do those liability discussions get handled, and what does that look like in the real world?
Sure. Let me try and cover content, authorship, and enforceability quickly. Fundamentally, if there's one takeaway that the audience finds in this discussion, is that it's a responsibility of of the project manager or the program manager or the business leader that wants to get something done to do this fundamental thing in a trust framework, which is to align what I call two different code bases. There is the technical code, the software code that drives these systems. And then there's the legal code, the regulations, rulemaking, etc. What a trust framework does is basically speaks to, or has content where the technical code and the legal code are in alignment. So in trust frameworks, as we've mentioned, you'll see lots of call outs to different technical standards. And you'll see lots of call outs to different regulatory or other requirements. Annette mentioned GDPR as a good example. On the legal side, SAML, OpenID Connect are examples of open identity standards. So the content really aligns these two code bases and brings them together. The authorship of that really can be as simple as, forgive me, Annette, the case of Aruba, where Aruba sorts out the fundamental precepts of interoperability and managing the stakeholder interest and comes up with a framework. The good news about these frameworks is that, like computer code, it's easy to steal stuff. And what I mean by that is we envision a virtuous circle where, as these frameworks are developed in the airline ecosystem that Annette spoke to, each airport or each airline authority will be looking at the example of others and constantly be taking standards that are referenced in one context, adding them to theirs, using legal language and precedent in law, adding it to theirs. So while trust frameworks are front-end loaded and they are challenging to put together, they do have this virtuous circle. Content can be replicated in other instances. The authorship remains in the purview of those that will be signing the document. Last and not least is enforceability. Like any standard, the test of a standard is its adoption, and adoption is really gated by how trustworthy it is. So we've been experimenting in the OpenID Foundation with self-certification, which is a low opportunity cost, low economic cost, high integrity way of providing for trust, a trust tool, if you will. So what we do is that we ask people to publish the results of their conformance to a given technical standards, in this case, OpenID Connect, to publish those results and to do something really important, to make those results available to their competitors for a peer review and for a global outsourced review of conformance. Lastly, we ask an officer of the organization that's being self-certified to make a legal statement, to put their brand on the line and say that these test results of conformance to a standard are right and proper and representative of a given company at a given point in time. So the self-enforcement, a neighborhood watch, if you will, in US terms, is really a critical part of these global standards. Because we don't have the option of calling in the blue helmets from the United Nations to enforce a global agreement, we have to find a way where we align the interests of the participants in expanding a market or expanding a proposition or providing extra security. We have to align those interests with the interest of the common, which is to have this team of rival or competing interests understand fundamentally that without cooperation, the market won't grow. Adjacent products won't be sold into new and expanding identity-oriented markets. So self-certification is one of the many new enforcement tools or trust tools that help these frameworks hold together on a global basis.
So Annette, what are the enforceability mechanisms that you all have in place?
Well, in Aruba, we have our document in place. So we can refer back to our document, and it has now 3 parties. But when more airlines will join, of course, we will have more parties to this agreement, which I don't think will change very much. It's a very simple agreement, and it also regulates how, in case there are liabilities, there are issues at stake, how we deal with it. So our self-certification is in a local framework is not so difficult because we've set the standards and we adhere to that. The self-certification that Don mentioned, that OIX is promoting, is something that is very interesting if you look at the challenges that a One ID global framework will have to look at or will face, because we deal with trust frameworks that have countries in their governments, control authorities. So usually if there is a issue that you deal or that you try to regulate crossing borders, it takes a treaty to organize things between countries. Now, if we want to organize this, and this is not only countries dealing, but countries are important stakeholders in these trust frameworks nationally. So you would usually go to a treaty, but a treaty would take like 10 years. So
Right.
no, it's not. Yeah, not even exaggerated. So that will not be possible. So we have to look at a way by which we can have these, because the trust frameworks are public-private. This is very important to realize, that a trust framework for a passenger facilitation is always public-private. Because if you keep the government out, you don't have what we call a seamless flow across an airport, because you would still have a hurdle, which is the border. So to have a good trust framework for a seamless flow, you will always need a government. They're crucial. Plus, there's a lot to gain for governments to join. This is exactly the reason why we get them to move ahead with us. But this is something that we will look into the next year. How can we get governments to join and accept standards? And I think we may find something in the certification and the self-certification and the self-enforcement of that. I hope that the trust between governments will be an important stimulating factor to start with some big airports, this trust framework.
Excellent. All right, we are just about out of time, but we do have one audience question that I would like to address, if we can do that really quickly, and that is, what part of a business organization would be the lead driver of that company's participation in the development and acceptance of a trust framework? Would it be the tech organization, the info security org, or product management org?
In a perfect world, it'd be all the above. I know Steve Jobs at Apple talked about concurrent engineering, where as they were developing a particular product, the marketing people and the legal staff would be working concurrently with the engineering group. In the ideal situation, that's how trust frameworks are best developed. In the real world, it's often developed by the technical folks and then thrown over the wall to the lawyers. So what we've been doing at MIT and plan to do at the Stanford School of Law and Informatics in February is to expose some of these trust frameworks, like the one at IATA, to the professors and the student body at Stanford School of Law. Later in the year, we'll do it in Oxford in the UK, and make sure that the best and brightest in the law profession are beginning to understand not only identity systems, but also these frameworks as new legal instruments to promote trust and interoperability.
Oh, interesting. Okay, well, we are unfortunately at the absolute limit on our time, so I want very much to thank Don and Annette for taking time to join us today, and to thank our audience as well for hanging in with us over the last hour. We will be back with a biometrics trust and safety webinar next week with Maxine Most from Acuity Market Intelligence. You can register for that on our website. And as always, we'd like to invite everyone to attend our No Identity Conference coming up in March in Washington, D.C. Thank you all and have a wonderful rest of the day.